Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 450th New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on Francesca Woodman, featuring Lissa McClure, Katerina Jaranek, Corey Keller, Elizabeth Sussman, and Lyle Rexer. We're thrilled to have the poet Ty Cooper here, who will read to close today's program. We'd like to share a special thank you to Marian Goodman Gallery for sponsoring today's program, and we encourage everyone to visit the current exhibition, Francesca Woodman, Alternate Realities, on view through December 23rd of this year. A few notes before we get started. Here at the Rail, we acknowledge Black Lives Matter, and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you all to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we'll be posting shortly. Over the past 21 years here at the Brooklyn Rail, we've undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication, art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, along thoughtful social and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we need your support. This December, we are fundraising $150,000 in 31 days, and your contribution will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and operations at the Rail for the coming year. Please check the chat for more information and links to donate that we'll be posting shortly. But now to introduce today's guests and host. Lissa McClure is Executive Director of the Woodman Family Foundation, which stewards the work and legacies of Betty Woodman, Francesca Woodman, and George Woodman. She directs the vision and strategy for the foundation with the board of directors and oversees its administration, operations, and partnerships. She's currently also on the board of directors of the John Baldessari Family Foundation. Artist and curator Katerina Jaranek is the collections curator for the Woodman Family Foundation and also serves on the board. She was the curator of the estate of Francesca Woodman for more than a decade prior, during which time she organized numerous international exhibitions of and publications on Woodman's work. Curator Elizabeth Sussman serves as Sandra Gilman Curator and Curator of Photography at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. She co-curated the 1993 and 2012 Whitney Biennials and organized the retrospective Gordon Matta Clark, You Are the Measure in 2007. Other exhibitions include Rachel Harrison, Ava Hess, and Diane Arbus. Independent curator and historian of photography, Corey Keller, is based in Oakland, California. She recently stepped down as curator of photography and acting head of the photography department at SF MoMA, where she was a member of the curatorial team from 2003 to 2021. Her exhibitions include Dawood Bey, John Beasley Green, Francesca Woodman, among many others. And last, but certainly not least, independent critic, curator, and writer Lyle Rexer is the author of The Critical Eye, 15 Pictures to Understand Photography from 2019, The Edge of Vision, The Rise of Abstraction in Photography from 2009, among many other books and publications that he has published in catalog essays and articles on art, architecture, and photography, and contributed to such publications as the New York Times, Harper's, Art in America, here at the Brooklyn Rail, among many others. So with all of that through, Lyle, I am now passing the mic over to you.
Thank you, Nick. And I also want to thank, first of all, my co-panelists. I guess that's not quite the right word, but because I hope that they're going to be doing most of the talking. It's really a distinguished group of people, and I'm really excited to kind of be in the same virtual room with all of them. They are the experts, and I just want to say that I teach photography, and Francesca Woodman is very important to my curriculum, but I consider myself more of an educated fan than certainly than an expert. So I'm glad to be surrounded by people who have studied the work deeply. And I noticed from the chat as well, or from not from the chat, but from watching people sign in, that there are quite a few people in our audience who have a direct experience of both of Francesca's work and of the person herself. I think it's going to be actually a wonderful opportunity for us to have a conversation with all of us. Anyway, I look forward to that. The show itself at Marian Goodman, I've seen, I think, in my career, I think 2 or 3 shows, at least 2 and maybe 3 shows of Francesca's work. Francesca Woodman's work. This show in particular, which has some unseen material, and it was really particularly moving for me. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But my opening question, really, as I was standing in the show, is something to direct to all of you, and that is, Francesca Woodman's work has been around for obviously quite a while. It's been the subject of a great deal of criticism, some of it very, very enlightening, some of it not so. And it's also been the subject of some remarkable shows, including the San Francisco MoMA show that Corey Keller was involved in. That was kind of a game changer for me. I saw it when it came to the Guggenheim. And so my question is, this show arrives at Marian Goodman. And my question is, why now? That is, are things different, say, over the last 10 years since the major retrospective took place, that would make the work talk to us in a different way, that would encourage us to rush to Marian Goodman to see this work that we haven't seen before? And I just wanted to put that out there, just to get a sense of sort of what the atmosphere is around this work. And then we can get into more particular discussions about how it came to be. So that's a general question for the group, and I just wanted to open that up. Why Woodman again now?
And I feel compelled to jump in if we're all going to be, we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
We'll get there. Well, I'll try to answer, which I think the very esteemed curators among us can answer better than I, about the last decade and the climate. I will say that from our perspective at the foundation, certainly, Francesca's work opens up so many worlds and has metaphorical, allegorical components and such technical skill. She knows how to make such a gorgeous photograph that they are just inherently compelling. And I think that doesn't ever get old or tired. I can't say that I think that there's a new reason for that, but I do think it's quite interesting and telling that generationally it just continues. I mean, it's happened for, the better part of 35 years now, since that first show that Anne Gabhart, who was here in the audience, I see. So amazingly put together. And I think because of Francesca's skill, it feels like she extends an invitation to a viewer, and a viewer, they just keep continuing to accept the invitation to enter her worlds. And I would say that is a reason. We will talk more about access to material that is fresh and new, but
right,
that's not really your question now.
Right. Well, any other thoughts about that from Corey, since you curated the show in 2011? Obviously very aware of not only Francesca Woodman's status or position in the world of photography, but also to audiences. I'm thinking about my students in particular, and I've been teaching for not that long, about 15 years. And I've watched Francesca Woodman give permission now to kind of a generation and a half of young, mostly women artists, which is in some ways very interesting to me, that I'm not seeing the similar response from, you might say, the other gender side. But I'm very interested to see that permission granted in a way over those decades. And I wonder if maybe that's kind of a place to think about her work as well, the kind of permission it grants to other artists.
I mean, I absolutely think that that's part of it. But what I was really struck, Lyle, was when you asked, like, why Woodman, why now? Those were the opening lines of a review of her work in 1986, I think, in response to Anne's show, actually.
Right.
I forget her first name, but the Kenny was the last name of the critic. And so, that question is, I mean, when as a curator, that's the first question you always ask yourself: why this artist? Why now? Why here? But the answers, of course, change over time. I mean, when I took up with the work in 2011, part of it was very practical terms that George and Betty Woodman, her parents, felt ready to make work available, that they were willing. I was very adamant that I wanted to show vintage prints, because not for the sort of object fetish quality, but for me, that tells a story about what Woodman, felt about those objects, that there was a sort of a kind of connection to the work that was very palpable, and that was important to me. And now we're looking at a moment where George and Betty have sadly passed recently, and there's sort of other opportunities to look at her work again. But I do think that it means something very special to students. I'm teaching too right now, and
Mhm.
all the students feel a connection to her work.
Well, the other side of that question, and I think Katrina was sort of hinting at it, and this has to do with the practical nature of this. These are, at least according to the gallery, many of the work in the show, it's really kind of divided almost in two halves, are works that have not been seen before. And this is the front room, you might say. And these are all, as I understand it, vintage works. And these are all works that have not been exhibited before. So I'm very interested in kind of the decision to bring those particular works out. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about kind of the curatorial side of this and the decision-making side. Which works, why these works, how did the process work? How did the process of bringing these to us take place?
Katerina, you want to start, and I'll.
All right.
Since it was a team effort, we're a pair connected.
I'm sure you'll have plenty to add.
Yeah.
Well, again, as Corey said, and Lyle, as you alluded to, I mean, there is sort of a practical aspect to this in that after George and Betty's recent passing, the works by Francesca Woodman and archives were bequeathed to the foundation. So, and our goal is to keep Francesca's, or to steward the legacy of Francesca's work, to think about how it remains in conversation with contemporary culture. And, Lissa and I, early on in our days, are not very many days so far of the foundation, had the incredible privilege to literally go through all of the works. And I know Corey is another person who's had the privilege of doing this. And Lissa and I, we just started to see more connections between works that perhaps hadn't been shown together before, things that really seemed to suggest she was working out ideas in a serial way. And we also had access to this archival material where Francesca actually writes incredibly articulately about what she's doing, what her influences are, the way that she sees her work. And so to us, we couldn't help but view the work from this kind of just this alternate perspective of wanting to show ideas fleshed out in groups of images and really try to take direction from the way that she spoke about her work. And again, because of all the incredible shows that have happened already, I think people have become familiar with the work, and some works have become so well known that Francesca is very much decidedly part of the canon and the dialogue about photography, but also art history, that now to be able to have this slightly fuller picture of some of those works and some ideas, seems like a good time to have that conversation. And that's a conversation Lissa and I were really interested in having about the work. And Marian Goodman Gallery was also interested in collaborating with us on that. So Lissa, did I miss anything you want to follow up?
I would say maybe just one thing to add, which is Francesca's voice, and you touched on a little bit the archival material, but we, part of our great job and also Herculean effort ahead of us is that there is all of this material, Francesca's personal papers, correspondences, journals, notebooks, this really, really rich material. And as we were looking at the photographs, which really sort of led us to want to put them in groups and see them sequentially. I mean, it's not something we approached the work with. I knew the work fairly well. Certainly Katerina knew it very well. And these new relationships and context really kind of jumped out at us. But then to have the added bonus of having access to her writings and able to give her a voice. I feel like she's her career has been so successful and she is so well regarded, and so much amazing scholarship has been done on her. But it is really nice to be able to have her words about her work and what her intentions kind of lead the way as well, and help people see the work through her lens. And it feels like giving her agency and autonomy and kind of empowering her, and that is an amazing gift that we're able to do that. I would also say, just to be specific, Lyle, in the North Gallery front room, all of those works have not ever been seen. We interspersed the never before seen with the more familiar. And I will say also just one last thing. What was so interesting and compelling as we were looking at the work is that all of these very iconic images that we know very well now from exhibitions and publications, it was amazing and very informative to see works that clearly came before or after that. And then also to start seeing them sequentially and in relation, sort of what happened next. So that's what led us.
I guess that prompts a couple of questions for me. And I'm assuming, or maybe it's wrong to assume this, but I'm assuming that because George and Betty are Woodman are no longer with us, so I can't ask them this question as well. But it wasn't a question of holding off on showing some of this material because there may have been differences of opinion about what ought to be shown, or in a sense about how Francesca Woodman might be, how should we say, continually renewed. Was there a kind of holding back before this, or was this simply part of a more natural process?
I'd say maybe a combination of both, and Corey should definitely speak to this. I would say that George and Betty were extremely careful stewards, and I would say from the beginning they wanted to show the most sort of strong, powerful photographs by this young woman to make the case so that she could be taken seriously. And I think, to their credit, it really worked. And then I think many of the decisions of what work came out was based on curators like Corey having access to everything and making choices about what they felt made a compelling show. So I defer to her to illuminate us on that.
It's such an interesting question, because Lyle, you were asking about why she's so compelling to generation after generation, and I think part of that is the ability to project onto her.
Absolutely.
There's this, and part of that has been possible by the kind of relative silence around the work, her silence. I mean, she speaks through her photographs. When I had the opportunity, George and Betty, well, poor Katerina was the one who had to haul all the boxes out of the storeroom for me. She's like,
it was my pleasure, Corey.
But George and Betty left me, I mean, they weren't even there half the time. I was completely left alone with the boxes, and I would spend hours and hours in George's studio just going through the boxes. And so that part was extraordinary. And, she writes on them, she used them as stationery. There's all kinds of stuff on the back. You can see that those prints had a life. They were more cautious with her written material. And I don't know if that was about being protective, or about maybe they just hadn't had the mental or emotional bandwidth to put their arms around organizing that. Francesca was many things, but an archivist, I don't think really was one of them. And so I don't think it was out of a kind of, I think it was just out of caution. I mean, when you lose a child that young, you have to remember that's how they were very tender, about her work. But I think what's so interesting about the show that Lissa and Katerina have put together is, when you do a show like the one I did at SF MoMA, you have to put some of those iconic works out there, right? Because you're reintroducing her work after 25 years in a way. But I kept feeling like they could have done 6 different shows.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking. And, I mean, it's not exactly the Gary Winogrand problem, but but there's the 6 different Francesca Woodmans. And I have to say, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, in the show itself and being in that space, I had so much more a sense of her presence in this show It's really hard to describe. And again, we know the iconic works. I mean, they're kind of implanted. But maybe it was the intimacy of the show or the small size or the number of prints. But there were so many things about the show where I felt like, I had her in the room with me in ways that's never happened before. And it's this kind of Francesca Woodman that I'd like to pursue a little bit. I don't know if you probably, Corey, you probably had that experience many times when you were obviously working on the archival material, but if anybody else has been in the gallery to see the show, I'm wondering if that was a similar experience. I mean, we've all been looking at the work for a long time, but for me, this was really remarkably moving. I could see a lot about her working, the way she works, the sorts of things. Well, we'll get into that. I think in the past, and you correct me, both of you, if I'm wrong, but she's sort of been treated to some degree as a kind of prodigy who emerged sort of full blown. There she was. She did these remarkable things from the kind of certainly even before she got to RISD. But in this show, I get a much stronger sense of movement and development and moving through. And again, even though it's a small show, moving through a lot of different ideas. Some work, some don't work, some she throws away. But that sense of movement and change and development, I wonder if both of you could speak to that, or all of you could speak to that sense we get from these pictures in particular.
I think that one of the remarkable things about this show, which we haven't talked about, is the catalog that was brought out at the same time, where the essayist is this wonderful, in my opinion, wonderful writer, Chris Kraus, who I don't know. I queried whether she had any experience of Francesca Woodman, but apparently she was pretty new to this subject. And I felt she considered the work in a very straight on way. And I think that she gave us access to a clear picture of Francesca as sort of an extraordinary, but an ordinary person too. Somebody
right.
who's, and I was very, very struck in particular by the Rome period. I feel like this is a great revelation of this show and of this artist who kind of emerges as extremely gifted, extremely troubled, if you like, and who finds herself in Rome at a very particular time of the mid-70s and really makes some sort of intellectual connections that were quite intrinsic to her, that had nothing to do with her family at all. And to me, this was the catalog brought out this in a marvelous way, and particularly the debt to surrealism, which I wonder, Corey, if you can talk about that from your vantage point. To me, this is what makes her very current now.
That's a really interesting point. And it's funny because I was rereading my own essay after reading Chris's essay. I was rereading my essay. And then I was like, I seem to have spent all the time on RISD, and like I dealt with Italy in just a few paragraphs, and I cannot explain why I did that. And rereading it, it seems like a major shortcoming of my own work. But I think that was what she found in Italy, was that, these ideas of surrealism were things that she had been exposed to sort of obliquely before, but that she really encountered them head on in Italy in ways like in that bookstore, the Maldoror bookstore, where she would pore over the materials and apparently sometimes shoplifted.
So they say.
So they say. So she was a poor student.
Right.
But I love the way she talks about her work in relationship to Nadia, the book Nadia.
André Breton.
Breton's book, which is illustrated with photographs that have essentially, they're not illustrations. They have nothing literally to do with the text itself. They form a kind of elusive pairing. And what she tried to do almost the reverse. She started with the photographs and then used these found notebooks that she found, 19th century notebooks that she found in thrift stores and bookstores, and then put her own photographs in. So to create that kind of tension between the extant text and her own creation, which I find extremely interesting.
I wanted to just to add to, or maybe reiterate that the Rome, and I'd love to hear you guys talk a little bit more about this. The Rome years absolutely jumped out at me as a result of this. Both the work that was being made in Rome because of their contact sheets that really kind of reveal a process, but also because some of the work that followed immediately after that, where you can kind of see, in a way, sort of the fallout. But this idea of her kind of engaging with surrealism in a way that, I mean, we kind of use this kind of loose, I think a little bit loosely, her debt to surrealism, I suppose, because she tends to use a lot of symbols. But the thing that really struck me, and I'll see if you agree with me on this, is that there's a difference. It's as if she's not using the things in her pictures to make dreams. It's almost, it felt to me, let's get back to my experience of the show, as if she was using these objects or these things that talk to her in ways to kind of repossess them. Because a lot of the things that come up in those pictures, gloves and the conch shell, and I mean, a lot of the egg, a lot of the objects are simply familiar from, I think, a lot of sort of previous surrealist art. But it's almost like she's making them hers. And I found that tremendously compelling. And just as I think, I felt like I was in a kind of very much a gendered space, that I felt like she was taking over a tradition that had been primarily male and completely kind of making it hers, repossessing those symbols, repossessing those objects. I wonder if I'm off base on this, because the whole show I felt like was not directed to me. I felt like it was so gendered, and I really liked that. I really responded to that. But I could feel it in a much more palpable way. I don't know if I'm off base here, but I'd love to hear kind of what your response is to that.
I think it's important that the symbols that she chose, I mean, it's interesting. I'll go back to, it's interesting because she spoke about surrealism and its importance. And of course, the surrealists were very interested in the way everyday objects were imbued with this incredible sort of psychic power, but particularly the way photography could transform those objects into something like but involuntary sculpture or something, an object invested with totemic meaning. But she was also interested in pictorialism, sort of turn of the century photographic practice, which was based on pre-Raphaelite painting, in which those symbols like flowers and things like that were also very heavily loaded, kind of like a rebus almost, that a viewer could read by decoding the meaning of those symbols. I mean, the fact that the symbols that she chooses are, I would say, are not particularly subtle. I mean, you give, I mean, the eel, the conch, the egg, the glove, she's, so I actually feel that there's some ambivalence there about a sort of heterosexual, there's a play on the sexuality that I'm not sure it was entirely intended for an audience of women. I'm not sure. I mean, she's certainly inserting herself into a male world in certain ways, but I don't really feel like she co-opts that symbolism completely and takes it to another place.
Yeah, that's really what I was saying. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's very compelling to me. Quite apart from how some of the images are just so surprising that I hadn't seen before. This one in particular that's up on the screen now, I'm kind of wild about this.
And you don't see her eye at first, and then
No,
slowly
exactly.
at the very lower corner is that very playful eye. There's also, I think, you kind of can't ever get away from the formal structure of the work. Also, she was so talented. I think her content was so rich and so inviting and alluring that people get really transfixed, but she really knew how to compose a photograph as well. And so I think that added to the sort of draw.
I have another. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, like, I'm so intrigued by she used those eggs and things. Also, she photographed men with them like nestled in their collarbones, like
Right.
these really vulnerable parts of the armpit, the collarbone, these parts of the body that are sort of tender and unusually exposed. And it's really interesting, the juxtaposition of the egg in the palm and the armpit. She really was very powerfully aware of the sort of vulnerability of the human anatomy, if that makes sense.
I'm very struck looking at this, almost all these works in the show, that there are very few where her own face confronts you.
Mhm.
And she's very comfortable, or seemingly so, with making the body central to all her images, so many of them, and such unexpected views of them. But the one thing she seems extremely uncomfortable about is her own face. And I wonder if that's true insofar as the works that are chosen for these shows, or whether that's true throughout her whole body of work, that it's her own face in particular is something that's really off limits. There's that one sequence with the glove where she's in a tea house with her woman friend, where you actually see Francesca's face. She's one of the characters in this little narrative. But other than that, it's really absent. And I just wonder if, Corey, if you've seen more of the work than anybody has, or Lissa, and that is this true throughout the whole body of the work, or just the edits of the work, where that her own face is not there's a very rare image of her.
It's a very interesting point, and I don't know that it's something that was consciously done, but I think there are quite a number of photographs in which her face is present, and and some are in this show. But it's interesting that her person feels through her face feels so in the background, and I think, to me, this is also very overall intentional in her work. I think often we look at Francesca's photographs, and people assume it's her, but oftentimes she had a model stand in for her. And my reading of that is that it was sort of irrelevant to her. If, she was a stand-in for an idea, in a sense. It wasn't, I read it as, it's not her, it's herself performing the idea that she's after. And so another woman could stand in for that as well. And so I think it's interesting how much confusion there can be about who is the model in the photograph. And then, of course, there's that quite well-known photograph of her and the three friends, all with a mask of a photograph of her face on the front, that is called About Being My Model, which is it's not in this exhibition, but is interesting in terms of having another woman be a stand-in for her. And what I think some of this adds up to is her interest in allegory, and her interest in, thank you, Corey, that's the photograph.
Yeah, and there's actually 4 pictures of her in that picture.
Yes, because
the 4th is on the wall.
Someone didn't show up. There was supposed to be a 4th woman.
Exactly.
And she didn't show up. Yeah. So, but I mean, she talks about, again, in this writing that we've been able to come across, and it's very clear in her work that she's interested in allegory and making allegorical images, and when you see the literary references that she cites, she's always talking about what she's reading and how she's trying to catch glimpses of other authors in her work. I think she is less interested in the self than in an allegorical vision, which I think is also gets back to that idea that there's so much for people to project onto these images. And I think it actually speaks to how successful she was as an artist, that she was actually doing this thing that she set out to do, to make an image as a stand-in for larger themes in art history. And the idea of the Rome years too, again, she writes about how that was when she really started to very consciously think about themes in Italian art history: angels, annunciations,
crucifixions,
and to really incorporate those ideas into her photographs in a very conscious way. So it's interesting, Elizabeth. I'm not sure that it was incredibly intentional to not show her face in the works in this show, but I think it perhaps comes from wanting to highlight this other aspect of her work that is not reading it so much as self-portraiture, but more as these kind of mysterious dramas and allegorical images.
Yeah, I think allegory is a really kind of good way to approach this. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that, to go back to my students again, I've got two groups, and they often talk to each other, but in different languages. And one is a group that is kind of empowered by Nan Goldin's work. And that's kind of a gift that keeps on giving. And then another is a group that's empowered by Francesca Woodman's work. And you couldn't find two more different photographers. But over time, I realized that they do have something in common, in that what you see is not exactly what you're getting. And that really intrigues me, especially in Francesca Woodman's case, where that I feel like that's absolutely right. We're looking at somebody who appears to be so personal, but is in fact much more calculating, much more, like you say, symbolic or allegorical. And there are times when I feel maybe a little bit that way about Nan Goldin's work as well. As confessional as it appears to be, it's much more calculated. And just from an outsider's perspective, or as a viewer's perspective, I really like that game playing. And I don't think we maybe give Francesca Woodman enough credit for that kind of working in that space, maybe. I don't know how you feel about it.
Exactly. I mean, I agree completely. I think one of the questions we were thinking about putting this show together was sort of, what if you thought about her self-portraits not as self-portraits, because they likely are not, in many cases. And I mean, Roz Kraus a long time ago made the argument, and is still, driving it home today, that this was not expressionistic work, that
Right.
she was not, this is not about a self. And I agree, it's definitely a construct. And that construct is going through lots of motions and engagements in these very structured and constructed environments that Francesca comes up with. And I think we weren't super conscious of not having sort of the more classical full frontal nudes with Francesca's piercing gaze, at the camera, which is also always quite strong. We wanted to sort of ask that question of how else could you read her presentation of the female body? And I think the fragmented body parts that we were drawn to, one of the themes that we kept coming back to in the show is these hands and feet. I mean, who knew she took so many photographs of hands and feet? Thank you. You're very good, Nick. You're very good. And it's interesting because she is so known for her sort of nude self-portraiture, but there's so much more. And if you think about the Italian art historical, depth of knowledge that she had from being raised practically part-time in Italy, from a very young age, and seeing so much Italian art with her family, it all shows up. And the gestures, there are these mannerist hands that are so beautiful. And I think giving equal playtime to those fragments of the body as to sort of the full body felt important to us as well, to just kind of, again, keep expanding the possibilities for the dialogues around her work.
Lisa, it's so interesting the way you were talking about it, because well, first of all, like the hands and feet. I mean, George told me the story was that basically they would take the kids to the museum, like, that weekends were for going to the museum.
Oh, yeah.
And that they wanted to look by themselves and would give the kids sketchbooks to, occupy them. but that kind of, if one was really going to sit there with a sketchbook and really learning to observe and to look, and I mean, it's so clear how much art she looked at, and how attentive she is to so many different kinds of observation. And to go back, Katerina, you know, you're talking about the self or the self-portrait, and I mean, I've always been struck by not only her face, even when her face is there, it never really feels like a self-portrait, but that the nude body is also a way of sort of transcending the temporal, the present, and becoming a blank, which always was interesting to me, given her interest in fashion, because of course fashion is a way of wearing clothes that show you are of a moment, a particular moment in time, and her efforts in later life to see if fashion photography wasn't going to be a way of making a living. I always sort of love those pictures because they're really some of the worst fashion photographs
Absolutely.
as fashion photographs go, because first of all, she wore these like crazy vintage clothes and they have nothing to do with the present moment. They're not, you couldn't tell when those pictures were taken, and a fashion photograph should be rooted in its time. So I always thought that was sort of this tension between her desire to be out of time, and her interest in clothing, is sort of they knock heads a little bit.
And I think that is interesting in relation to a quote that Chris mentions, and is also in a letter that is reproduced in the catalog, where Francesca's writing about her work, and she talks about being interested in using the nude. I mean, that's how she refers to herself, as a nude, in a, as like in an ironic sense, like a classical painting nude, and talking about timelessness and how photography interrupts the idea of timelessness. And I think that's also interesting in terms of thinking about her place in time in this kind of diversion into fashion photography, and I think also supports the argument that, or a way of looking at these that is less about self-portraiture. She's trying to make she's trying to make photography timeless, which both you could say is inherent to and undermines the medium itself. It's like kind of the contradiction of photography that she understands. And it's interesting how her references for that are about classical painting.
Right, or museums, or that incredible series that she does inside the museum in Florence,
Actually,
for
I was just
example.
going to ask that. Nick, can you show the 3 La Specola, the waxworks museums, please? Oh, I should tell you what number, I'm sorry. Where 14, 13, and 12, 13, 14, and 15. Yeah, there we go. And this is an interesting case because this was this wild waxworks museum in Florence called La Specola that literally shows gutted women and fetuses and body parts. I mean, she even said once that she noticed that sort of the body parts of these waxworks related in her mind, or sort of connected to the fragments of the hands and feet that she saw in Italian art, sculptures that had been broken over the centuries. Super interesting.
This very same museum was the site of a group of Zoe Leonard's work in the 90s, I guess. So,
You've heard this. There's a show to be done there.
Well,
I don't know whether Zoe knew this work or not. On the subject,
I bet not.
On the subject of fashion, she did have a specific model, and somebody that she admired, and that was Deborah Turville. And Deborah Turville was always accused of being a bad fashion photographer because she never really, showed the fashion very well. And so, but she knew what she was doing, and she was trying to also make sort of antique or kind of older kind of photography out of fashion photography. So I think that Francesca knew that work and knew that as fashion work that she could aspire to doing herself, and was maybe even influenced by. I just want to say something about this stage of interpretation of Francesca's work. And that is, I think what's called for really is kind of more specific sense of her context. I mean, I think that we really want to know more about, her teachers at RISD, her experience. And Corey, you probably know much more about this and then we are beginning to find out things about Rome. And we're beginning through the papers to find out that she liked to read Breton and she liked to read Colette, so that she's not, this kind of extraordinarily gifted person. She has very specific,
Right.
Positions in the art world and in the intellectual world. And I think what's interesting is that she and Nan Goldin, who Lyle mentioned, are almost contemporaries. I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
Nan is just a couple of years older than Francesca. And in fact, they both come from sort of, well-to-do, middle-class, Northeastern area, private school even, et cetera. But what Nan and her cohort turned to at really the same time with the ballad, which ends up being published in the 80s, but really begins in the 70s, same period as this.
Yep.
She turns to quote unquote her reality, which is, now a classic world of downtown New York and so on, but it's kind of the real world, or so-called real in quotes, if you like. But this is what Francesca is doing is something altogether. It's different. It's European. Everybody's used the word allegory a lot. I mean, it's just like diametrically positioned, on different wavelengths.
Elizabeth, I wonder if you would agree with this. I should, in full disclosure, I was Elizabeth's curatorial assistant for the 95 Nan Goldin retrospective. So we spent quite a bit of time thinking about it. But I was interested, because I wanted to come back to that, Lau, what you said about Nan and Francesca's work, because Elizabeth, I completely agree with you in terms of the content of the work. But one of the things that I often talk about with my students about Francesca's work, and I think it's also evident in Nan's work, I mean, I'm convinced there was this urgency to make the work. It wasn't an option. It wasn't optional. It was compulsory. I mean, it was a way of living, a way of being in the world. And I think that that's one of the things that the students often miss about Francesca's work, was not only how talented she was, but how extraordinarily hard she worked, and how, I mean, she's living in this studio where she wasn't even supposed to be living. They had no shower, no kitchen, no heat. And Nan lived in, I mean, it was in similar kind of conditions, but that the work was deeply urgent. It had to be made. And I think that might be something that they both shared, but I would agree with you in terms of approach to the photography is very different.
Yeah, I wanted to just apropos two things. First, there was that wonderful anecdote in the catalog, in the catalog for the current show, where her friends in Rome talked about the spoiled brat, right? But what they also said was, this woman is the hardest working person on the block. I mean, she is always working, and that really comes through in the show, which leads me to this other idea about context and how we have to understand the context of her work a little better. We need to talk about the contact sheets in this show, because I think those are in some ways a sort of game changer. And I wonder, if we can talk about what they show us about not just her working process, but the way she thought about photography as a thing to do, and also about this dialogue that we were having before about her sense of the time of the photograph, or how photography works with time. Because I was riveted by these contact sheets. I'm kind of a contact sheet freak anyway, but these just gave me so much to kind of deal with in terms of how she tells a story, or maybe even how we've come to think about her as a photographer, and that maybe these contact sheets provide a very different context for this. I just want to know what you guys think about it, because I love these contact sheets. I think they're super interesting.
Well, I'll say that we were very clear that we wanted to include them because we think exactly as you just said that they really help tell the story. And we were also very clear that we wanted them to close the show rather than open it. We wanted people to see works that were unfamiliar, that they had to, relate to and sort of give some time to try to understand and work their way through the show. And then at the end, it's sort of this we hope kind of a gift to say, this is where these came from, or this is what else was happening in her mind. This is what else she put together. And I think another key element for us was that it's so revealing of her choice making, and it goes back to the agency
Sure.
giving her voice. You can very clearly see which images she chose to print. In this case, a couple of them are in the show, and then all the others that she didn't, and also her trials, right? Her trying things out, different positionings and different approaches to see the work. There's a great anecdote along with that. When she was in Rome that year, she sat for a photographer who then had an exhibition at a gallery that she went to see her, the photographs of her. And she wrote him a note to congratulate him, but also to say she wanted to see his contact sheets because she was so curious to know why he chose the images that he chose. And I think it's so telling about her own approach that she very much gave herself a lot of options and played out an idea or a theme, and then knew very intuitively which ones were going to work and which weren't. Yeah, I mean, everyone I'm sure has more to say on that. Or maybe not.
I saw Katerina, there was an interview, Katerina, where you just said something about how looking at the contact sheets made it so clear that none of her photographs were one-offs or
Absolutely
accidentally achieved, but that were the product of really thoughtful working through an idea. And I thought that was a really good description. Even in making the selection for the show, sometimes she would have printed 2 or 3 very closely related pictures, and it wasn't always obvious how to choose which one. And sometimes you could show them as a grouping, but she really worked through those ideas. I thought the way Katerina described it in that interview was really spot on.
I maybe I'm kind of sort of diverted a little bit, or I don't know, not deceived, but maybe self-deceived. It's obvious she's thinking about photography or photographs as working toward the thing that you choose as the image that you want to make, or that you want to live with, or that sums up whatever it was you were after. But the other thing that I'm talking about, context, these are so performative, and some of the contact sheets, it's almost more than working through ideas. It's almost like a performance in the studio, and it starts to link up. And I don't know her background well enough to know how much performance related stuff she was looking at, but there was so many things taking place in the studio where people were working through combinations, or as you said earlier, series work, performative work. And there's obviously a long list of women who are working that side of the street, quite apart from the Bruce Naumanns and the other kind of conceptual artists, or the Viola Conchis. But I wonder if we can maybe even think about the work as more sort of performance in the studio or in the space, even though she's thinking about the single image at the end. These struck me as like so much more vital in a way than simply a final choice, if you know what I mean. I don't know if you felt that way, or I feel like the context in which we've been looking at her is maybe, again, it needs even more opening up, so to speak.
I think I'm also really drawn to the performative aspects of her work, and I have to tread lightly because she did not, I don't think, consider herself part of that.
No, I'm sure not.
Declared herself not a feminist. I mean, she wrote that.
Yeah.
She definitely felt that. I can't help but seeing her in her time, and especially when we started seeing these groups of works. Actually, Nick, and I'm sorry, I don't have the list in front of me. The shrouded works actually were close. Number 62, if you could show that, please. this is an instance of a very well-known photograph in the center, and then 2 from the contact sheet on each side that we included in the show and put them together. And to me, this is so action oriented. I mean, there is a sequence to it, and there is that performative aspect. Again, not to put that on completely and to negate any other readings. I think part of what we're so interested in is just kind of opening up rather than recalibrating things, recontextualizing. Sorry.
How much
Yes.
evidence are you finding in the archive of her knowledge of what was going on at this time? You mentioned that she did know Bruce Conner's work, or had had at least something in her archive that indicated she might have known his photographs of angels. But I mean, she was going to school in Rhode Island, so how connected was she to what was going on?
I talked to some of her classmates who talked about the kinds of visiting artists who came to campus. I mean, I don't know, listen, Katerina will have to speak to this more, but I think she was looking at a lot of work. I mean, that's my feeling. I mean, I think she knew that, I mean, she grew up with 2 artists, professional artists, and so was already part of a world that her fellow students just weren't part of. And I have to assume that she was looking at a lot of stuff, but whether it's specific, I had mentioned to Katerina and Lissa, a little known artist who I think seems related, but who was in the Boston area at the same time Francesca was at RISD. So I mean, I think there's some really interesting work to be done. And to me, I mean, I know a lot of people spend time like looking for these influences as a way of sort of diminishing her contribution. And to me, I mean, first of all, she's a student. You forget like she's not just a student, she's a child when she's making some of this work. So it would be nobody goes to art school and doesn't absorb, if they're paying attention, and doesn't absorb some of the stuff that they've learned. And so to me, it actually only makes her work richer, because it's both the expression of this individual vision, but of an individual vision formed in a particular historical moment, which was one of the richest moments in photographic practice. I mean, in terms of its diversity and creativity, but also all of these other strains of art making outside of photographic practice.
I think Corey brings up that very important point, that she was the child of 2 professional artists and had some sense of like, how do artists be, how are they in the world? And I think we're still going through the archival materials. There are some things that she clipped, or show announcements, or even her Blue Book essays from RISD, where you can imagine the slide lecture comparing 2 images. I mean, those are more historic. My sense is that she was quite aware. I mean, there's, from the New York period, there's newspaper clippings, things that she sent to George in Colorado. I have the sense, especially in that time that she was in New York from 1979 to 80, that she was really putting herself out there. She was meeting people, she was going to see shows. I mean, she really was trying to be a professional artist, and she had models for how to do that, which I think a lot of people her age didn't. Another point that Abigail Solomon Godot made, which I think is very interesting, in a sort of follow-up essay to that original essay she wrote for the Wellesley College catalog, it was in 2014, was, because she sort of goes back and looks at the way that she discussed Francesca's work in 1986, and talks about feminism and influences, and it sort of rereads her reading of Francesca. But she talks about she sort of concludes that there was a zeitgeist, and that Francesca, whether she specifically knew of certain artists or really specific things that were happening, again, as Corey points out, she was a student. She was, there was an energy in the air. There were conversations about the role of women in society, whether she specifically identified herself as a feminist or not. I think she took her work incredibly seriously. So I think sort of she was by default, perhaps. So, but she, even the idea of trying to be a fashion photographer was a way of supporting herself and a way of, trying to be in the world in a professional way. So I think that those specific influences of understanding how to be an artist and just, even though she feels so outside of her time, I actually think in many ways she was really absorbing what was happening in her time. And that point that Solomon Godot made really kind of drove home to me that idea. So
one of her friends told me that like they would go to the galleries in New York to look at artwork, but that Francesca would bring her work with her, like that it was, she wasn't so interested in looking at the other person's work that she wanted to get the galleries to look at her work, and that she really was ambitious for herself as an artist, and not in a derogatory way, but that she was disciplined and knew what it took. She knew how much hard work it took to be a professional artist.
That's a good point, Corey.
Yeah.
If she took her work with her, who do you think she showed it to? And were they blind to it?
Well, she showed it to Danny Wolf. I mean, that's how he ended up showing. Danny told me that she came to him with her portfolio, and that's how she ended up. I don't know who else she showed it to. But it wouldn't be the first gal. I mean, if you had a 21-year-old show up at your doorstep with a portfolio, I mean, I think that I don't fault them too much for being blind. But Danny recalls meeting her, and he said she was like, she knew what she was about.
Yeah, I think maybe we're reading it backward, maybe I am, but that really comes through in the work. I mean, she's not going to be pushed around at all. And the stories I heard about her when she was at RISD were, it really didn't matter what course she was in, and it didn't really matter what the assignment was. She was just going to make her pictures and turn them in and say, hey, here it is, and it's kind of a lesson I love my students to learn. It's like, forget about my assignments. Just go make the pictures and bring back what you think you need to do. And she's really determined. I mean, she's absolutely right. And that comes through. I think things got way more complicated in terms of thinking through her own work. And you guys, I think, are talking a little bit about that. And in that regard, I would be remiss if I didn't make reference to, there's a dominating image in this show, one that really jumps out, and that is the very large picture that she made in 1980, I think, called Zigzag. And I guess that's the final picture in the show. That's the latest one that was made. You can correct me if I'm wrong. It's a monster picture. I think, Corey, remind me, but there were some large pictures in the 2011 show as well. And I wonder if we could just go back there and kind of think about what this picture was all about and what was going on.
Maybe we can bring that.
Can we pull that up?
That one, yeah. And then we added a couple more from that.
Right, exactly.
To be at the end, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you see a real shift in her work around this period towards a more formal exploration, more interest in less about the sort of human psyche and more about visual patterns and rhyme. I mean, I have a theory that I don't think anybody else besides me likes, but I like it very much, which is that, first of all, she's in New York, and I think she's realizing that some of the work she's making is out of sync with other things that are going on. I mean, I think it was Chris Kraus points out that, she's making that, Cindy Sherman is making the untitled film stills at the same time that Woodman is making this kind of work. But my unpopular theory is her relationship to the pattern and decoration movement.
I agree.
Yeah, no one's ever picked up on it. I want someone to do some work on it, because her mother, Betty Woodman, is a ceramicist whose work is associated with that. George, her father, painting. Robert Kushner, who I think might be on this call, she, I think, worked for him as an assistant, but I know she babysat for him. I mean, and he's the OG of the pattern and decoration movement. Joyce Kozloff, who's a neighbor, and this sort of the work with the interest in the sort of relationship between craft and high art, the feminine and the masculine, the formal and I mean, her interest already in textile and pattern. But I just feel like in this work, and that was a movement that sort of never really got its due at the time, but it's being revisited now in many ways, particularly with the re-interest in craft. But anyway, I feel like there's something to be done, but she clearly took inspiration from both the visual and the philosophical underpinnings of that movement in this, and the large scale work. I mean, wallpaper is part of that movement. So I think there's something really interesting there.
I want to ask a question that relates to my work on Arbus, and it seems like after I worked on the Arbus show, every time I gave a public talk, the first question out of the audience was, why did she commit suicide? And then everybody would read backwards into her work to sort of find clues to the suicide. It was just paramount. But from what I can tell, Francesca Woodman her reputation hasn't been bullied by her death. Is that true?
I don't know, it came up in almost every discussion.
Yeah,
I wish that were
every
true.
discussion. That's right.
I'm glad
Everybody
that
talks.
you don't see that.
Yeah,
Elizabeth.
exactly.
because
Let's keep it that way.
Let's keep it, exactly, because
There's
she
so
was
much more to see.
very much alive making this work and was very driven to make this work. One thing I wanted to, that sort of I perhaps builds on what you were saying, Elizabeth, and also Corey, just regarding this later work, that and Chris cites this quote from a letter at the end of her essay that she writes to her friend Giuseppe Gallo in Italy, that she was trying to make work that felt less personal and more sort of monumental and had this greater significance than her sort of very intimate black and white photographs. And I mean, I still see very similar concerns, which I think support the argument that that this wasn't diaristic, is that she's still very concerned with the body in space and the figure in space and how the figure relates to space within this later work. It's just on an architectural scale. I mean, I know the dimensions are underneath this image, but I don't think people, unless you see the show, can really conceive of how big this work was, and it wasn't even the biggest. If you go, Nick, if you don't mind, to the very last slide, and it's a little hard to get a sense of the scale here, she made this work called The Temple, which is in the Met's collection, where she posed her friends as caryatids, just wearing her work clothes. She had a job as a secretary, and you see this sort of pleated skirt suit and other photographs, but they sort of become the robes of these caryatid figures that are holding up the temple that is made from details from classically inspired bathrooms around New York City. So there's a sense of humor to this, but also you can see that she's trying to get away from that very personal, and as she calls it, very kind of feminine way that her work has been characterized. So again, maybe it's trying to respond to the time, or maybe this goes back to allegory, or a way that she felt her work was perhaps being misread. I mean, I can't know that, but it's interesting that this is the direction that she was moving in the last year of her life.
Yeah, I mean,
that's
her ambition.
I mean,
I'm sorry.
She was maturing as well, and I think sort of understanding that maybe moving out of the more personal realm. And she said this to a friend. She was ready to she had done that earlier, but she was really ready to move on and conquer other avenues.
Yeah, and there's also this New York thing, which is like go big or go home, kind of, And I just feel like again, reading backward into this, I really like that big print, and it comes out of the work that she was doing at McDowell just before that. I really like it. I'm kind of on that page, but I do feel like there's this kind of feeling. And again, if you think about the scale that her parents could work on as well, they could bring it. I mean, they could do large scale work, and I feel like there's a kind of pressure to like, okay, it's time to step up. And I know a lot of I knew a lot of artists. I know a lot of artists, and we all do. And we know what that feeling's like to come to New York. And it's like, okay, it's go big or go home. And that's intense, especially for somebody like her who's been working in that small window for so long and has done so much with it. I really felt everything about the show was just incredibly poignant to me in that regard.
It's funny. I feel sort of empathetic toward her in a certain way, because I mean, you also have to remember she's 21, right? She's left art school is a sort of safe. It's a luxurious space for working, and then the idea of being a student, an art student, and being a working artist are different ones. But what interests me in a way is that during her lifetime, this particular piece was one of the ones she actually received recognition for, because this was exhibited at the Alternative Museum in, I think, was it 1980? Is that, I can't remember.
80, yeah.
80.
Spring of 80.
As part of a show about the sort of expanded field of photography. So she was experiencing I think that must have been a huge deal for her, but she was experiencing some success with this work and this direction. It's interesting.
And that was the time that she was making artist books, and that one of them was published. I mean, she went to McDowell. She was, she was showing with Daniel Wolf. I mean, I think she was really putting herself out there and taking what she was doing seriously, and was starting to get some recognition for this.
Here's a question: was she, was her work able to be seen by other artists in New York then, just at that period before she died? Because you think of somebody like Anna Mendieta, who is just kind of part of the New York scene, and very much becoming and very much performative and interested in the photograph and in her own body. And I just wondered, was Francesca's work seen?
She was in one or two group shows at Daniel Wolf. So, I mean, with other photographers. And then this show was in the spring of 1980. And again, it was a very, as Corey mentioned, the context was really this expanded vision of photography, or view of photography. So those, I think, were the sort of two New York presentations that, as far as I understand, of her work, which is, not nothing for a 22-year-old. So
yeah, absolutely.
Probably not known to the downtown artists that were at AIR Gallery, for instance, like Mendieta, right? I mean, probably not. She wasn't there alive long enough to have impacted them.
Hard to know.
I know. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I don't know. And but I can imagine when I cast my memory back those many years, I can imagine that many artists weren't particularly interested in looking at photography, qua photography. It wouldn't be the thing that would float their boat. Some of them might wander in from the periphery because they were doing more conceptual work, but in general, photography was not something that it was my experience that anybody really cared that much about. It was kind of musty and kind of old fashioned anyway. So, but this is definitely not that.
No.
So I'm just looking at this piece on the screen, and I had never seen it, but when the show that I organized traveled to the Guggenheim, the Met undertook a restoration of the piece and was able to display it.
Yes.
And I mean, you don't really get a sense of its monumentality. And I'm going to display my poor math skills, but it's like 12 feet tall. I mean, it's an enormous, enormous thing. It's more than 12 feet tall. And I mean, I just love thinking about this shift in scale from those tiny little prints that she was making before, and what it does. I mean, I will say that if you want to talk about the tragedy of her early death, is when you look at something like this and you just wonder what might have been, just because she clearly had more in there was more in there to come out. That's what seems clear.
So I know Nick wants to open this up to questions and answers, or mostly questions. But I did want to ask one thing quickly before we move on, and that is, what are future plans for the archive? Will there be more shows coming up? Not to kind of make you tip your mitt, but I'm really interested in.
Oh my goodness, I have the phone ringing in this office right now. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Hi, okay. Yes, I mean, and our hope is now that we've gotten a handle on what we've got and how much sort of fresh material and interesting ways of looking there are, that I mean, Katerina and I work every day and we think, oh, this is a great idea for a show. Oh, this is a great idea for a scholar to investigate. And we also, once the archive itself, the proper archive is fully cataloged, the goal is to have a study center so that actually scholars can come in and have access to all this material that hasn't been readily available before. And I think we're already getting very excited by kind of a younger generation of scholars and writers and filmmakers who are doing work on Francesca, and you know, just to keep things moving forward and expand the conversation.
Well, maybe I can kind of enter here because I think Lyle may have left, but we'll be right back. I want to thank you all so deeply for this conversation and for this exhibition. I think Francesca Woodman just tends to be one of those artists that everyone does have a kind of a special relation to, and it's been truly an honor to hear you all talk about this. And to that end, I encourage everyone that is able to go to Marian Goodman Gallery and to see this exhibition on view through December 23rd. And we do have time just for a couple of questions. So if it's okay with you all, I would like to open it up. And I think I'm going to pass the mic first to Kay in the audience. So Kay Harar, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hi, thanks so much for this wonderful presentation. I was just curious, did Francesca make films? There's definitely a filmic quality to her work, and I wonder if she would have evolved into a filmmaker if she'd continued on. Thank you.
She made, Carrie, do you want to go?
Well, no, you go.
She made videos primarily, I believe, in a class at RISD, and they are extremely performative, and they were included in the exhibition. That we have a grouping of 8 of them, I believe. And what's interesting is that I'm not sure she would have gone in that direction, because I think she really employed the video in the service of photography. And I think often it goes the other way, but for her, photography was such a beloved medium that it seemed like she was using the videos to get to the moments that she wanted to capture for the photographs. That's just my, and Jenny Blessing also wrote so well in the Guggenheim SF MoMA catalog about that.
That's what I was just going to say, that Jenny wrote a really lovely
Yeah.
essay in the catalog if you want to read more about her work.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to our friend G.E. Schwartz.
Thank you so much, Dick, and thank you for the panel for bringing this today. Now, we know famously that she read Andre Breton's 1928 novel, Nadja. Did she read other surrealist literature as well? And I ask because I really get a very strong Leonora Carrington kind of contact with her work. But that might just be me.
Well, I think that the Maldoror bookshop in Rome that she encountered, I don't know exactly what she was exposed to there, but it really was dedicated to, you know, surrealist, Dada, all of those very radical, you know, early 20th century movements. And I think she probably encountered a lot of different surrealist literature there. And you know, again, in her sort of letters that she wrote to people from New York to her friends in Rome, you know, she mentions, oh, I met the person who runs Man Ray's estate, and I feel that I need to meet him for Giuseppe and Paolo, who owned the bookstore. So I don't know, I haven't found a lot of reference to exactly what literature she read, but I think she spoke about how much that bookshop and her friends in Rome really introduced her to a lot of unknown or not very well-known works. So.
Well, thank you, GE and Katerina. I'm going to pass the mic now over to my colleague, Anya.
Hi, thanks, Nick. Thank you for this conversation. It's been so wonderful. I am going to run to see the show this Saturday. I'm asking a question on behalf of Lori and Brewer. And she noted gender in the work and asked if you would consider, or if you've considered, the special place that the Charlie series also holds within the entirety of her works, considering who those images are for, who the audience is, the feminine body, and especially the images of the male life drawing model. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'll go. I would say I particularly hate those pictures. I probably shouldn't
I
say
wish
that.
we had one to
I
show.
really don't like them. They creep me out, if I'm being honest, I think. So Charlie was the life drawing model at RISD, and Woodman did a series of pictures of him in which I think I described him as leering genially while cupping his genitals. So there's like there's a series of pictures in which it's one of the very few series of works that she made with the male body. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of, when the male body appears in her work, they're frequently kind of these slender, not particularly stereotypically masculine bodies. They're often, I felt quite, I don't know, gentle, is that the word? Almost impotent in a way, but Charlie is very special. And he's this kind of genial figure sort of cavorting about nude. And then in the last of the sequences, she jumps in with him. And to me, that was one of the few places where I felt like this kind of question of sexuality was addressed really head on, in a way that it was more elusive and poetic and lyrical elsewhere, by sort of putting their two naked bodies in together in the same frame, that there's a psychological charge that emerged. It's funny also, but also slightly creepy. I don't know. I have a real visceral, as you can tell, reaction to those particular pictures. Maybe someone else with a less biased view can address them.
I might have a biased view from another perspective, but I actually, I didn't find them overly sexualized. I actually thought is sort of two equals, both nude, both in this Providence space that she shot so much work in, with the windows that were always there, with some of the mirrors on the floor, with a lot of the props that showed up in the Providence photographs. And it felt like they had equal footing in a way. And I also liked sort of turning the table on sitter and photographer, because she played that game with herself being subject and object so much that it felt more expansive to me personally. And I also just think there's such a great series. And speaking of shows, someone should do a show of everyone who was at RISD who shot Charlie the model. I think that would be a great show.
Listen,
Thank
I think
Lori.
I like your view better. I'll take yours.
All right, well, thank you. I respect yours as well.
Well, thank you both. We're kind of nearing the end here for timing, but we do have Lyle back, and I just want to make sure I pass the mic back over to Lyle once more, perhaps for a last remark or word. Lyle, are you able to turn on your mic?
I'm back.
There you are.
I'm sorry, my computer crashed, so I got it on a new one, or different one. No, I don't really feel like I need the last word on this, because we have the people who really know the subject are here in the room. But I do think that what's been wonderful about this discussion, and I think we're kind of all on the same page, which is that Francesca Woodman's work is far richer even than in a sense than we already know, because the context for it keeps changing and the things that we see in the work keep growing. And for me, it's been really quite a revelation to be able to be, first of all, to be part of this, but also to have a chance to go back and really walk through it in more detail. And I don't know, to me, this work, and you know, we can say a lot more about it, but it is very much, again, like Nan Golden's work in a very different way. It's kind of a gift that keeps on giving. And as long as it keeps on giving, we're going to keep thinking about it, and we're definitely going to keep teaching it. And so it's been a wonderful opportunity, I think.
Thank you, Lyle, also for just your really open and fresh perspective, and sort of the being willing to let yourself be taken in by the show, more than we could have asked for, everything we could have asked for. So thanks for bringing that. And it was such a pleasure to speak to you ladies that we know so well, but it was great to talk in this context. So thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I want to express our deep gratitude once more and our congratulations on this exhibition. And I know we're right at the end here, but here at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Ty Cooper, to the stage. A graduate from Pratt Institute, writer Ty Cooper works in experimental prose, poetry, and digital language art. They are a senior production assistant here at the Brooklyn Rail. And I'm very happy to pass the mic over to you, Ty.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you all for this conversation today. It's been so incredible to hear you all talk about Francesca and to see Francesca's work. I was blown away by the photos, and I will tag along with Anya to run to see the show on Saturday. I'm very excited about it. I'm going to be reading 2 segments of brand new work that connect to each other, that are made from some things that have been knocking around in my head lately. I am a daughter born so that the world can have a daughter. I am a daughter who breathes so the world can breathe. The world sat with her legs upside down, with half of the daughter that she needed dripping down her thighs. The world threw out all the tabloids when I became the daughter with a body and a belly. The world learned about daughters after I was only half a daughter anymore. The world brought me to a wedding and asked if the word daughter still fit me. It is turtleneck itchy, and I stand with my back hunched outside the fitting room so that she will see that it doesn't wear me right. The world called to ask if I was going to cut up the daughter parts of me, and she cried scared and relieved when I lied and promised I wouldn't. I am a daughter who stays a daughter so that the world can see a daughter grow out of her. I've been on this train for hours. My body is just left of center. I keep it in my knuckles and my lungs. I've been on this train for hours, and I want to write a poem, but I don't remember how. I want to write a poem because I don't think I can. I remember telling children to start with a list. I've been on this train for hours. I've been on this train for hours, and I've been talking all the time, inside and out. I've been on this train for hours, and it doesn't stop moving, or it has never moved. I've been on this train for hours, and I've been thinking about the feeling of being on it forever and what people will call me this whole time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ty. I couldn't think of a more perfect poem to end today's talk. I once more, I just want to deeply thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much, Corey, Elizabeth, Katerina, Lissa, Lyle, and once more to everyone, our good friends at Marian Goodman Gallery. Thank you, Linda, Jonathan, everyone over there. And we've just posted the link once more for the details for the exhibition you can see on view through December 23rd. We are here every day at 1 p.m. And we encourage you to join us tomorrow for our 65th Radical Poetry reading, curated by Angela Narciso Torres. You can now all turn on your microphones to say hello and goodbye as you leave. And stay safe and well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank
you
you
so
so
Bye,
much.
Nick.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Thank
much.
It's wonderful.
Great, wonderful conversation.
Beautiful show.
Thank you. Really interesting discussion. I
Bye-bye.
enjoyed it.
Thank
Such
you,
an
Elizabeth. Thank you,
interesting
Corey.
discussion.
Super grateful over here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks
Thanks
for
all.
the rail. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you.
Well, take care. Everyone have a wonderful day. Have a great meeting, Lissa and
Thank
Katerina.
you. Thank you. Several
Thank
of our
you
board
for
members are here too. Yes.
And we'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you again so
Bye.
much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Likewise.
Bye.